Mrs. Murray here again, and I'm going to do a power and conflict question with you today. Exam is getting ever closer, so let me just share my screen with you and my visualizer, and I'll show you the question that we're going to look at today. Okay, so this is the one. Oh, hello. This is the one that I'm going to do with you. Let's make sure it's not upside down. That would be incredibly useful. There we go, the right way up. Okay, this is the question that I'm going to look at with you today. So it's the power and conflict question, and it's this. Compare how poets present the power of the natural world in Exposure and one other poem. So, remember the paper, quick reminder, you've got 2 hours and 15 minutes, a really long paper. I would imagine that's probably one of the longest GCSEs that you have, to be quite honest with you. That's not very clear. Let me just get that a little bit. Ooh. There we go. That's better. 2 hours and 15 minutes. So your first question is going to be an inspector calls, 45 minutes on that. Then the power and conflict, 45 minutes on that. Then the unseen, 35 minutes, because that's worth 24 marks and these are worth 30, and then the 8 mark at the end, okay, which you're only going to spend 10 minutes on, because there's no point spending any more time than that on it, because the marks aren't there. If you have a look on YouTube, you'll see I've already done a question on the unseen poem that you had in the mock exam that you last did, and I did the 8 mark question, and I will do one at the end of this week, so please go back onto YouTube and check for those. Okay, so power and conflict, 30 marks, like I said. Exam situation, you've done your inspector calls one. At least you've got a poem published. No idea, obviously, what poem's going to crop up. I'm going to go with Exposure. I want to choose an Exposure question for you because it's such a brilliant poem. It has got so much beautiful imagery in it. There's just so much to analyse. Every single paragraph is jam-packed with things to write about. The question that I'm going to do with you today is about the power of the natural world or nature. And of course, it could do a nature response, or it could work for effects of war, and a war question as well. So that's why it's a great poem, because it ticks 2 boxes for you, doesn't it? Okay. So in an exam situation, you've got Exposure there for you printed, and your job you've then got to do is choose the poem that you're going to write about that comes with it. And of course that isn't published for you, so what you say about that has got to come from your memory. So the better you know the poems, obviously the easier it is to answer the question. So in terms of the power of nature, what choice had you got? Well, the power of nature, you could have chosen Ozymandias to go with it, or the prelude Stealing the Boat, or obviously Exposure's there for you. I'm going to choose Storm on the Island to go with my response, because I think that's a really good fit. Tissue has got references to nature, not one of my favourite poems, I'm not going to fib. And Kamikaze, obviously, the pull of nature as he's flying across, and he sees the shoals of fish, etc. That would go as well. But I think the best fit for me is going to be Storm on the Island, because it's so very obviously about the power of nature. The whole poem is, isn't it? So for me, that's the best fit. Now, I'm not going to annotate the poem for you now. I'm not going to model that. I'm going to model how to answer the question, because I think that's more important at this stage. There are YouTube videos where people do annotate the question, the poem for you, but I'm hoping that all of you have got one of these which you can use for revision, and you've got an annotated version of the poem in there that you can look at. Okay, so please use that, but I don't want to waste your time annotating that for you. All of them are annotated there for you. Okay, so I'm hoping you've got a copy of that. Very, very useful. All right, so that's not what I'm going to do. So I'm going to walk you through sort of like an answer to this. and how I would tackle it. Okay, so let's start off with our all important thesis statement. Okay, or our big idea. Big idea sums it up brilliantly, doesn't it? Because it's the big, we don't get into the nitty gritty in our thesis statement. We don't what, how, why do we talk about the big ideas of both poems. So my thesis statement, let's call it that. You don't have to label it, obviously. I'm just doing this for your purposes. You just get stuck into the poem. So I'm going to say both Owen and Heaney. Now, this is a comparative question, okay? So I would suggest that you always start a comparison question with both, all right? Because as soon as you use the word both, you are comparing, aren't you? So just a really simple way to get it started. So both Owen and Heaney depict nature as a powerful and powerful, almost overwhelming force. However, so they both do that. However, Owen's portrayal is deeply tied to the futility. That means the pointlessness, the futility and suffering of war. So it's not just about the power of nature, is it? And suffering of war, where nature is an additional unfeeling adversary. Okay, that means enemy. So it's another thing that the soldiers are fighting against. Okay, all right, that's the problem, isn't it? In contrast, so as soon as I'm using a phrase like in contrast, I am comparing, aren't I? Heaney's poem reflects a more complex relationship with nature, where its power, no apostrophe, okay, only it is has an apostrophe, where its power is both feared, because the islanders are scared, and respected. And they sort of respect nature as well, don't they? And respected. And the human response is one of resilience and communal strength. Communal strength. Because they pull together, don't they, the islanders in the poem? They pull together, communal strength, they come together. Remember all those we build our houses squat, we are prepared at the beginning of the poem. So through their different styles and contexts, very different contexts, aren't they? Both poets, okay, comparison, both poets underscore the formidable and often indifferent force of the natural world. So I'm linking in with the title there of the question, which talked about the natural world. Shaping human experiences and responses in profound ways. Okay. Nature, the natural world, is having a massive impact. Okay, now you've then done your thesis statement where you've talked about both. You have then got a choice about how you're going to tackle this question. It is comparative, so you must compare. But like an Inspector Calls and Macbeth, Macbeth and A Christmas Carol, where you've got to talk about the extract and you've got to talk about the play or the novel as a whole. There isn't a 50-50 split between the two. You must do both. You have to write about exposure or the named poem and one other poem, but there isn't, a percentage that you must talk about them. So that's going to depend a lot on what you've got to say. Now, you've got a couple of different ways of doing this. You've done your thesis statement. You could then write exposure, kind of like one paragraph, and then do Storm on the Island, one paragraph, and then go back to exposure, blah, 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 then go back to Storm on the Island, then conclusion. Do you see what I mean? You could do that. You could talk about both in one paragraph. I find that difficult because I write too much. My paragraph would get enormous. So yeah, it depends how much you're writing. So you could go, in out if you like, or you could go exposure, 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 and then some kind of linking connective, whereas, or in a similar way, differently, whatever, that linking connective, and then go Storm on the Island, Storm on the Island, Storm on the Island, conclusion. You see what I mean? There is no kind of like set way of doing it. It's going to be how you want to plan it. What I've done here for you that I'm going to write with you now, I have gone kind of like exposure, and then I've gone Storm on the Island. The only reason I've done that is because I just wanted to get all my ideas shared with you about one poem at a time without confusing you. I think probably the best way of tackling it is kind of like a paragraph about exposure, then one about Storm on the Island, then a paragraph on exposure, and then one on Storm on the Island. You don't have to make direct comparisons, though. You can tie yourself up in all sorts of knots like that. As long as you're starting your paragraphs with phrases like whereas, or however, or both, or in a similar way, you are comparing. Okay, so you don't have to make this really complex and complicated. Using words and phrases, maybe for revision on Sunday, and I'm sure you've got a list of them somewhere or you can Google it. Have a look at those linking words and phrases and make sure that you've got them at your fingertips. You're in your brain and you know that you're going to use them, all right? Because as long as you're using those, you are comparing. That's why I always start with both, because straight away, both Owen and Heaney, whatever I write after that is comparison, isn't it? In contrast, I'm comparing, however, whereas, etc., etc. All right. So you don't have to overcomplicate this. You don't have to make it more complicated than it needs to be. Like I say, I sort of favor this approach, really. Big idea where you talk about both exposure, Storm on the Island, exposure, Storm on the Island, conclusion. But it's if you prefer to say everything you want to say about exposure, but link, and then everything you know about Storm on the Island, but make sure you're using these phrases so it's very clear that you're comparing. Well, that's okay too. I've seen top mark answers with both of those ways of doing it, okay? So don't make it unnecessarily complicated. Right, I'm going to write about exposure now. I want to share my ideas with you about exposure, okay? And the power of nature. So I'm going to start off like this. I suppose it's a bit of a big idea right at the start about the natural world in exposure, and then I get into the nitty-gritty of it all. So I'm going to say, in exposure, Owen presents the power of the natural world, because that was my question, the power of the natural world as a relentless, indifferent, and overwhelming force that exacerbates, that means to make worse, exacerbates the suffering of soldiers during World War One. Okay, so can you see what I've done there? It's a bit of a kind of like almost a little big idea, if you like, isn't it, to my first poem. It's a relentless, indifferent, and overwhelming force. Relentless because it never stops. It's indifferent because he depicts nature as not caring about the soldiers, and overwhelming because they can't cope with it, can they? Now, I'm just going to put a couple of headings for you. Don't do this in an exam, but I'm just signposting what I'm talking about, okay? So the first thing I'm going to look at is personification. And I'm going to say, you don't need to do that, just write. I'm just signposting this for you so it's absolutely clear to you what I'm writing about, okay? Owen personifies the wind. The wind, describing it as an active, hostile, all right, because it's unfriendly, isn't it? An active, hostile agent. Obviously, we've got to back things up. Our brains ache. That's a comma, that's an in. Doesn't look like it. In the merciless, iced east winds that knife us. Okay, an incredible start to the poem. So what's happening here? The wind is given a malevolent, lovely word, malevolent, evil characteristics, and it is deliberately, that's the effect, the personification, isn't it? Deliberately attacking the soldiers, adding to their physical and psychological torment, okay? Because they're suffering, their bodies are suffering, but so are their minds, aren't they? Okay. Yes, that's always the effect of personification, isn't it? That something is deliberate. You personify something and it is deliberate, isn't it? Okay. The imagery that he uses in this poem. The poem is rich with stark cold imagery. Why? What's it doing? That emphasizes, you know, guys, if you're ever unsure of what something's doing, emphasizes or emphasis is you're often onto a winner. That emphasizes, so when in doubt, it emphasizes the harshness of the environment. Funny word, environment, it's spelled. So we've got pale flakes with fingering, stealth, come feeling for our faces. There we go. What's happening here? The snowflakes are depicted as almost sentient beings. That means something that thinks and feels. Sentient beings creeping in to inflict further misery. And I haven't mentioned the alliteration there, and I'll tell you why, because I'm finding it difficult to kind of explain what the effect of that is. I think alliteration is a really difficult one to explain, but there's plenty of other things to write about. So if you're not sure what the effect of a technique is, I suppose what I could have said there was something along the lines of, which emphasizes the harshness of the environment. The alliterative phrasing of the snowflakes, something like that. I could have acknowledged its alliteration, but I don't need to. And I'm going to add to that the repeated references. That's my dog's ear, if you're wondering what's going on my laptop there. The repeated references to cold and ice, iced east winds. Don't forget my inverted comma. Iced east winds and frost. Underscore, that means like emphasizes, underscore the persistent and pervasive. Right, persistent means it never stops. That's the worst thing, isn't it, in this poem, that nature's endless. Okay, the cold is endlessly attacking the soldiers, and pervasive nature of the cold. That's a the. Oh my gosh, of the cold, which is as much a threat as the enemy soldiers. And that there is the point of the poem exposure, isn't it? Okay, not what we imagine, is it, that would happen. It's hard that the nature and the natural world is killing these soldiers as much as the enemy soldiers are, which I feel is kind of, you know, sort of shocking, isn't it? Right, the tone and the mood of the poem, important. So the tone throughout the poem is one of bleakness and despair. Okay, reflecting. So why? It's reflecting the soldiers, and my apostrophe after the S because it's all of the soldiers, hopelessness. It's the saddest thing about the poem, isn't it? There is no hope. And the unrelenting, never gives up, does it? Nature of their suffering. Goes on and on, doesn't it? The recurring line, recurring meaning it keeps happening, line, but nothing happens, reinforces, kind of means the same as emphasizes, doesn't it? But it's a different way of saying it. Reinforces the sense of stagnation, because they can't go anywhere or do anything, they stagnate, and endless waiting, where the only change comes from on my page over, comes from, hold that thought with me, comes from an F, comes from the worsening weather. That's what I wanted to say. Comes from the worsening weather. Okay. And that's the tone and the mood. It is, it's endless, isn't it? Owen also creates a mood of desolation and abandonment. They feel like no one cares, don't they? They've been abandoned. And abandonment. The soldiers are left to face not just the enemy, but also the unforgiving natural elements which seem indifferent to their plight. It's a cruel nature, isn't it, in this poem? Nature doesn't care what it's doing to the soldiers. Right, now I'm going to do a little bit about structure and form, okay? Structure and form, students, I don't know if you've been listening to other people on YouTube who say, oh, you can't get, a grade 7, 8, 9 without talking about structure. That actually isn't true. There is nothing on that mark scheme that says you have to talk about structure. But I would suggest only talk about structure if you've got something intelligent to say about it. Don't count lines and go, oh, this poem's got 15 lines, full stop. Why are you even mentioning that? Unless you've got something to say about it, don't talk about it, okay? Because you're not achieving anything. So what could we say about the structure and form of this poem? Right, the poem's structure, with its repetitive stanzas, okay, and the refrain, this is a structural point, I'm sorry, in the refrain, but nothing happens. Mirrors, right, I'm talking about what it does. Mirrors the unending cycle of suffering and the constant presence of the cold. Okay, so that's what that repetitive refrain is doing. Okay, it's the unending cycle of the cold. This cyclical form, right, why, what's it doing? Well, it emphasizes the inescapable nature of their predicament. Okay, it's ongoing, it's forever, it's endless, isn't it? Where every day brings the same bitter struggle against the elements. Okay, so I've talked about the structure, but I have made a point about it. That's the important thing. Now I'm going to mention the rhyming here. Now I'm not just going to say it rhymes. There's no point talking about rhyme unless you're going to make a point about it, like this. Okay, Owen uses a para rhyme, or we could also call this imperfect rhyme. Okay, means it doesn't rhyme perfectly. Why does he use that? He does it to create a sense of unease and tension. Okay, I think we could often say that about an irregular structure or irregular rhyme. It's always going to be doing something where it's symbolizing the feelings of the persona. Do you see what I mean? Because nobody could write in perfect kind of rhyming if they were emotionally all over the place. So what can I say? Words like nervous and nervous. See, that's put there. Nervous and nervous is offered as a rhyme, almost rhyme, almost. But the lack of a perfect rhyme contributes to the overall feeling of discomfort and instability, and that mirroring, that's ever so difficult to say, mirroring the soldiers, the apostrophe again, the soldiers' precarious situation. Okay. Right? So I've talked about the half rhyme, the lack of rhyme, the imperfect rhyme, the para rhyme, but I've given an explanation as to why the poet has used it. If Owen wanted to use perfect rhyme, he would have done so. He was a phenomenal poet. It would have been very easy. It's deliberate, okay? And it's that sense of kind of like, unease and discomfort and instability. It emphasizes that, it underscores it, okay? So yes, please talk about these things if you've got something specific to say about them. But there is absolutely nothing to be gained from just saying, oh, it rhymes, it doesn't rhyme, it's got 15 lines, it's got 4 regular stanzas, if you're not then going to say something about it. Okay, so you must say something, offer a reason for why that's happening. Themes and symbolism. Right, what else is going on in this poem? Guys, there's a lot. I did say that. It's a beautiful poem. It's so much to say about it. In exposure, nature itself is depicted as an antagonist. Okay, as an enemy. All right, as an enemy. That's nature. They've got enough enemies out there trying to kill them without nature doing it as well. The extreme weather conditions are portrayed as another enemy. That's what the natural world is doing in this poem, isn't it? Another enemy the soldiers must face. And one that is as lethal and unyielding, unforgiving, unyielding as the human enemy. That's what nature's doing in this poem. And the poem also highlights the indifference of nature, the indifference of nature to human suffering. Nature does not care, does it, to human suffering. The natural world is shown to be impersonal, uncaring, head out the way, uncaring, with oh, you can't see that, with the natural, with the cold, train of thought, with the cold and wind, continuing their assault, because it's an attack, isn't it? Their assault. Sorry. Continuing their assault. Really difficult doing this with a sausage dog. Right. Can you not, please? Yeah. God. Everything back. Sorry. Continuing their assault, regardless, is what I wanted to say, of the human cost. Nature does not care. Okay. Right. Now, what I've done, that's all exposure. Okay. Like I said, if I was doing this in an exam, I didn't want to confuse you by sort of dotting backwards and forwards. So I thought it was kind of best while I was doing this to sort of deal with one poem at a time, if you like. So that's why I've gone exposure, then I'll go Storm on the Island, and which is fine as long as I use my linking words and phrases. Okay, I think if it was me in an exam, I would want to do Storm on the Island, exposure, Storm on the Island, exposure, do it like that, but it doesn't matter. There's no kind of like point system where you get more for doing it in a certain way. Okay, now bit of a big idea about Storm on the Island in a similar way. All right, comparing, tick. Seamus Heaney I'm only going to call him Seamus Heaney once because it's 2 words. In future, I will call him Heaney. Do not call him Seamus. He's not your friend. Please, Priestley, or, you know, always call writers by their last name. So Seamus Heaney presents the power of the natural world. And again, I'm using the phrasing of the question where it called it the natural world as a formidable and awe-inspiring force that profoundly impacts human life. Because they both do that, don't they? And I'm going to say Heaney and a comma, like Owen. Okay, comparison, tick. Just a simple phrase, like Owen, and you are comparing. That's all the comparison has got to be. Uses, okay, doesn't need to be any more complex than that. I've seen really clever students answering these questions, absolutely tying themselves up in all sorts of knots where they try to do like really clever things with comparison when you don't have to. Keep it simple and straightforward. Uses powerful and evocative imagery to bring the storm to life. Okay, phrases like the wizened earth, the wizened earth, exploding comfortably, and the flung spray. It's when I do a dash like that, it's to signify a line end, the very windows. And spits like a tame cat turned savage. Right, this creates a dynamic, means sort of like moving, doesn't it? And vivid, lovely and clear picture of the storm's ferocity, that's like ferociousness, and unpredictability, to spell it out. The comparison of the spray to a tame cat turned savage illustrates how familiar elements can become dangerous and uncontrollable under nature's force. Because that's the point, isn't it, of the poem? That brilliant, you know, like a tame cat turned savage. The sea is how these people earn their living. It's normally their friend. It's how they live their lives. Without the sea, there wouldn't be a life on this island. They wouldn't be able to earn a living. However, when the natural world gets hold of it and turns it into a storm, then it becomes the tame cat turns savage, doesn't it? And it becomes dangerous and it becomes uncontrollable. So suddenly this thing that they live with day in, day out becomes something that is now working against them. To personification, we've got that in this poem too. So I can start with sentence with, like Owen, comparison, tick, Heaney also uses personification. Okay, no need to compare how they do it. You can just say that they both do it, because you've already talked about the personification in exposure. We're now going to talk about it in Storm on the Island. The storm is personified with human characteristics. Characteristics. Lost my way there. With human characteristics, adding to its menacing. It's a scary storm, isn't it? Okay, its menacing presence. The wind is described as strafes and strafes invisibly. Oh, it dives and dives, doesn't it? And strafes invisibly. Don't forget, you don't have to be word perfect with your quotes. It's not a competition who can remember the most. It's close reference to the text, not quotes. And strafes invisibly, evoking images of fighter plane. That's what that word strafes is doing. A fighter plane attacking, which suggests and gives the storm a deliberate aggression. Okay, right, that's what personification does. It makes whatever's happening sound deliberate. Okay, and that's why the natural world is so frightening in this poem, isn't it? Because the natural world is deliberately attacking the island and the people upon it. The sea and wind can raise a chorus suggesting that the natural elements are almost collaborating, working together, and almost collaborating in their assault. They're all getting together to do it, aren't they? In their assault on the island. Okay, that's what the personification is doing, making it sound deliberate, which makes it appear even more dangerous, doesn't it? Oh, we're getting there. It's a long one, guys, but I wanted to do this in detail with you, and just walk you through the whole thing. What else have we got in Storm on the Island? Well, we've got direct address and colloquial language used, haven't we? Colloquial language being that everyday type of language that we use to each other. It's less formal, isn't it? The poem, unlike exposure, okay, yeah, comparing. The adopts, that's the word I want, adopts a conversational tone, making it seem as though the speaker is directly addressing the reader or a community member, okay? That's who he's talking to. It could be us, the reader, or it could be to one of the islanders. This is evident in the opening line. In the opening line, we are prepared. We build our houses squat. We. This tone makes the portrayal of the storm more immediate and relatable, drawing the reader in to the shared experience of facing the storm. Okay, that's what he does. That we at the beginning, it's almost like we're pulled in to the world of the poem, the world of the islanders. We become one of them. Okay, nearly there, guys. Tone and mood. Right, what have we got going on there? The tone of the poem is tense and filled with anticipation. We feel anxious, don't we, for these islanders? The islanders are prepared. They've told us they're prepared, haven't they? Yet there is an underlying recognition of the storm's overwhelming power, okay? As seen in the lines, makes us anxious, doesn't it? As seen in the lines, we just sit tight. They're helpless, aren't they? Sit tight while wind dives and strafes. Military language invisibly. It's war language, isn't it? Okay, that's used. Despite their precautions, we are prepared. We build our houses squat. There is an acknowledgement of their vulnerability their vulnerability. We are bombarded. Again, that military language, yeah. We are bombarded by the empty air. And that empty air is the wind, of course. The empty air. This line underscores the paradox of the storm's presence. It is both tangible, that means sort of like real, and intangible. That's the paradox. It's tangible and intangible and powerful, yet invisible. Yeah. And he acknowledges that it's empty air that we're frightened of. It's this powerful thing, but they can't actually see it. And I just kind of want to then talk a little bit about structure and form. Okay. All right. But again, I want to show you that if you're going to talk about it, you've got to say, you have to make a point about it. So unlike exposure, storm on the island, it's okay to do that, guys, is a single continuous stanza. Reflect, right, why is it reflecting the unbroken and relentless nature of the storm? Okay, can you see how one stanza, unbroken stanza, kind of reflects that, doesn't it? It doesn't stop, does it? The lack of stanza breaks can be seen. Notice this tentative language, can be seen, could be the poet trying to do something. All right, it's okay to use that kind of language. Maybe, possibly, can be seen as mirroring the continuous assault of the natural elements. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't stop. So the stanza doesn't stop. Okay, so we've made a decent point about form there. Right, now I'm going to talk about enjambment. Enjambment, if you're not going to say something intelligent about why it's been used, because most poems have enjambment, if you can't think of a reason why or what the enjambment's doing, then don't mention it. All right. In the mock exam, I read all of this stuff about enjambment, but virtually nobody was able to give a reason for why the poet had used it or what the effect of it is. So here I can actually say something. The enjambment throughout the poem enhances the sense of ongoing action, okay, because it keeps going, of ongoing action, and the fluidity of storm's impact. Okay, right. Can you see that I've actually managed to give a reason there? I've actually been able to say why the poet has used it. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's probably enough there. And then you just do, I'm not going to do it because I think I've gone on enough now. You're going to be starting to get bored now. And I would just bring that to a close with some kind of a conclusion where I bring the two poems back together, and we can just use our thesis statement at the beginning to help us with that. We go back to the thesis statement that we started with to bring our poem to a close. Okay, can even use similar words and phrases and conclude it. All right. So I hope that was helpful. Some ideas about the poems there. Definitely revise Please Exposure, because it's a fantastic poem. It's got so much going on. It would be great, I think, if that was the named poem in the exam. I really do, because there's so much to say. It is wonderful. So thank you very much indeed for persevering with that. I hope it's been of some use, and I will do another unseen, and I will do the 8-mark question as well for you. Okay, and just again, I'm just trying to walk you through my thought process of how to tackle the poem, the kind of things that you can say and do. Okay, guys, thank you, and happy revising.